The frost didn't just nip at my skin, it chewed, grinding into the marrow of my bones until my breath was less a sign of life and more a trail of steam for the monsters behind me. My lungs felt like they were swallowing shards of broken glass with every ragged inhale. I could smell the copper tang of my own blood where the silver-laced shackles had flayed my wrists, a scent so sharp it cut through the crisp, medicinal aroma of the towering black pines. Behind me, the rhythm of the hunt was a terrifying percussion, the heavy synchronized thud-thud-thud of four-legged predators hitting the permafrost. They weren't just chasing me. They were playing with their food. Before the shadows, claim what's left of her. I want to know where the members of this pack are watching from tonight. Are you tucked away in the warmth of a city, or are you witnessing Ilara's fate from somewhere just as dark and cold as these woods? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's see how far the Rogue King's reach truly goes across the world. I stumbled, my bare feet catching on a jagged root hidden beneath the drifts. I went down hard. The snow wasn't soft. It was a crust of ice that raked across my cheek, hot and stinging. I stayed there for a second, my face pressed into the frozen earth, listening to the silence of the forest. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the low, guttural vibration of a growl that seemed to rattle the very ribs in my chest. I turned onto my back, gasping, my eyes searching the canopy of dark branches. A massive shadow eclipsed the moon. 7 feet of silver-gray fur, muscles rippling like tectonic plates beneath a thick pelt, and eyes, God, those eyes, glowing with a hateful amber fire. It was Silas, my alpha, the man who had promised to protect me when my parents died, now standing over me with his maw dripping saliva that turned to icicles before it hit the ground. I tried to speak, but my voice was a raspy, broken whisper, pleading for a mercy I knew would never come. He didn't shift back. He didn't need to. The message was clear in the way he bared his 3-inch canines, the silver light catching the wetness of his gums. He wasn't here to hear my plea. He was here to witness my expiration. The pack had cast their vote. I was the defect, the Omega with the broken wolf, and in the Silver Moon pack, defects were returned to the earth. 12 hours ago, the world was merely gray, not red. The Silver Moon pack house was a sprawling fortress of cedar and stone, perched on the edge of the frostbite peaks. It always smelled of wood smoke, raw meat, and the stifling, aggressive musk of too many dominant males in one space. For 23 years, this had been my cage. I remember the morning light hitting the kitchen tiles, dusty and weak. I was scrubbing the heavy iron cauldrons, my hands chapped and raw from the lye. As an Omega, and worse, an Omega whose wolf had never manifested, I was the pack's ghost. I cooked their kills, I cleaned their floors, and I stayed out of the way of their tempers. The steam from the boiling water rose in thick, humid clouds, sticking to my hair and making the thin fabric of my tunic cling to my spine. Every muscle ached with a dull, rhythmic throb, a reminder of the miles I had walked the day before carrying supplies from the valley. I felt him before I saw him. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure dropping as Silas walked in. He was in human form then, dressed in a heavy shearling coat, his black hair slicked back, looking more like a corporate predator than a literal one. But the way he looked at me, it was the way a man looks at a stain he can't quite scrub off his boot. He told me the council had reached a decision. The winter was harsh, the caribou had migrated early, and the spirits were hungry. I kept my head down, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my sternum. I could feel the heat radiating off him, that overwhelming alpha aura that forced my knees to tremble against the cold stone floor. He told me it wasn't about the food, it was about the blood. He said a pack was only as strong as its weakest link, and that I was a chain made of glass. The moonbind ceremony was tonight. If my wolf didn't wake by the time the moon hit its zenith, they could no longer justify my place in the circle. I looked up then, meeting his gaze, which was my first mistake. I saw the total lack of pity in those amber depths. I saw the calculated cruelty of a leader who viewed compassion as a contaminant. Behind him, his mate, Tanya, leaned against the doorframe. She was a vision of predatory grace, her blonde hair braided tight against her skull like a crown of thorns, her fingernails tapping a rhythmic click, click, click against a glass of amber liquid. She suggested he give me a head start, saying it would make for a better run and that the warriors were bored. The run. That was the euphemism for the Great Purge. I went back to scrubbing the pot, but the water in the basin was no longer just soap and grease. It felt like the rising tide of my own grave. The rest of the day was a blur of heightened, desperate senses. I noticed everything with a crystalline clarity that only comes when you are certain you are seeing things for the last time. I noticed the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of dying light, the smell of the pine resin leaking from the log walls, the distant, muffled sound of the younger pups yapping in the snow outside. I was memorizing a world I was about to lose. I tried to reach inside, to find that spark of fur and claw that was supposed to live in my soul. I screamed internally, begging my inner self to wake up, to save us, to growl back. But there was only silence. My inner wolf was a void, a hollow space where a roar should have been. I was just a girl, just a human girl in a world of gods and monsters. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and violent orange, the drums began. The pack gathered in the ceremonial pit, a natural amphitheater of rock. The scent of sage and burning cedar filled the air, meant to purify, but to me, it smelled like a funeral pyre. Silas stood at the center, his chest bare despite the sub-zero temperatures, the ritualistic scars on his torso glowing faintly in the twilight. He held the silver dagger, the moon bite. He called me forward, and every eye was on me. Hundreds of pairs of glowing irises, gold, blue, green, all reflecting the flickering torchlight. I walked forward, my legs feeling like lead. I could hear their whispers, a low hum of judgment. He took my hand, his grip like a vice, and the silver blade touched my wrist. The world exploded in white-hot agony. Silver is poison to us, even to those of us who haven't shifted. It burns the blood. It felt like he was pouring molten lava into my veins. He whispered in my ear to run until my heart burst. Because if he caught me before the border, he wouldn't be merciful. I ran. I didn't have boots. I didn't have a coat. Just a thin linen shift that was quickly becoming a shroud. At first, there was only the sound of my own panic, the wheeze of my lungs, the slap of my feet against the ice. But then, the first howl went up. It was a long, melodic note that curdled the air, vibrating through the trees. Then another joined it, and another. The pack was on the scent. I dived into the black spruce woods, the branches clawing at my skin like skeletal fingers, drawing thin lines of red that froze almost instantly. I could hear them behind me, the heavy rhythmic panting of beasts that could cover a mile in minutes. They weren't rushing. They were herding me. They were pushing me toward the northern boundary, toward the dead woods. The dead woods were forbidden. They were the territory of the ghost of the peaks, the rogue king. Legend said he was a monster so foul, so corrupted by darkness, that even the strongest alphas feared to cross his marks. I burst through a thicket of thorns, my shift tearing, leaving a strip of white fabric like a surrender flag on the bushes. My vision was starting to tunnel, the edges of my sight fraying into darkness. The cold was moving from my skin into my organs. My heart felt heavy, a slow, dull ache in the center of my chest. I couldn't go any further. I crawled into a small hollow beneath a limestone overhang, pulling dead leaves and snow over my legs. I held my breath, my teeth clicking together so loudly I was sure they'd hear me. Then the sound of the wolves stopped. I peered through the gaps in the brush. 3 of them emerged from the tree line. Silas, in his massive gray form, and 2 of his enforcers. They stood at the edge of a line of trees marked with strange, dark symbols carved into the bark. Blood-red sap seemed to ooze from the carvings, thick and smelling of iron. The boundary. Silas shifted back into his human form, a visceral, sickening sound of bone shortening and muscle rearranging itself. He stood there, naked and steaming in the moonlight, his skin flushed red with the heat of the shift. He shouted into the dark that I was in the rogue king's lands now, and that the king didn't take prisoners. He laughed, a cold, dark sound that echoed off the rocks, and told his enforcers to let the cold or the king have me, as I wasn't worth a war. They turned and vanished back into the woods. I stayed in my hole for what felt like hours, the silence returning, heavier than before. The wind began to pick up, a howling gale that whipped the snow into blinding white curtains. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was dying. The pain started to fade, replaced by a dangerous, seductive warmth. That's what they tell you about freezing to death. The end is peaceful. I closed my eyes, the silver glow of the moon fading to black. Suddenly, a massive crunch sounded through the trees. It was like a tree snapping in half. Something was moving through the snow, something much bigger than Silas. I forced my eyes open. The blizzard was so thick I could barely see my own hand, but through the white haze, a shape began to form. It wasn't a wolf. Not exactly. It was a shadow that seemed to swallow the moonlight, a towering silhouette that blotted out the stars. The air around the creature didn't feel cold. It felt electric. The snow didn't settle on it. It melted several inches away, as if the creature was a walking furnace. I watched, paralyzed, as a hand, a human hand, but massive, with claws like obsidian, reached down toward me. I tried to scream, but my throat was frozen shut. The figure knelt. I saw a flash of dark, matted fur, the gleam of heavy gold chains around a thick neck, and then eyes. They weren't amber or blue. They were the color of a dying star, vibrant, violet, and ancient. He didn't growl or snarl. He reached out and scooped me up, my small, frozen body disappearing against the heat of his bare, scarred chest. The warmth was so sudden it felt like a physical blow. I gasped, my head falling back against his shoulder. His skin felt like sun-warmed stone. He turned, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, carrying me deeper into the dead woods, toward the peaks where no pack wolf dared to tread. We moved through the storm as if it wasn't there. He didn't speak, but I could hear his heart. It wasn't the fast, frantic beat of a wolf. It was a slow, deep thrum, 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 like the beat of a war drum in the deep earth. Every time his skin brushed mine, a jolt of energy shot through my dying nerves, a phantom spark that made my dormant wolf shiver for the first time in my life. Finally, We reached a massive set of iron-bound doors, built directly into the face of the mountain. They swung open without a sound. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment, expensive bourbon, and something dark and wild, like a forest after a fire. He walked into a hall lit by 1,000 flickering candles, their flames dancing in the draft of his movement. He didn't put me on a bed or a rug. He walked straight to a throne made of blackened oak and dragon bone. He sat down, still holding me against his chest, his massive arms acting as a cage of heat. He leaned down, his breath hot against my frozen ear. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through my entire body, a sound so deep it felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. He told me I smelled of the silver moon and of their betrayal. I looked up, my vision finally clearing. He was breathtaking, a king of ruins. His face was a map of scars and royalty, his hair a mane of midnight black. He looked down at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an omega. I felt like a prize. He whispered that they thought they left me there to die, but they didn't realize he'd been waiting for a reason to burn their world to ash. He shifted his grip, his hand moving to my throat, not to squeeze, but to tilt my head back. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, his violet eyes boring into mine with a terrifying intensity. He asked if I wanted to know the secret of why my wolf never barked for Silas. I whispered a trembling question of why. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing my temple, and told me that a queen doesn't take orders from a mongrel. He said I wasn't waiting for a shift. I was waiting for a king. Outside, the blizzard roared, but inside the mountain, the heat was becoming unbearable. And as he leaned in closer, his fangs grazing the pulse point of my neck, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't the prey. I was the spark. The realization hit me harder than the cold ever could. All those years of being shamed, of being told I was empty, of being treated as a biological failure. It wasn't because I was less than them. It was because I was too much. My wolf hadn't been sleeping. She had been recoiling in disgust from the lesser males who tried to claim her. Now, in the arms of this Shadow King, I could feel her. I could feel a low tectonic hum beginning at the base of my spine. It was a dark, ancient thing, reaching out to the violet-eyed monster who held me. He felt it too. I saw his pupils blow wide, the violet light nearly consuming the whites of his eyes. His grip tightened, his claws slightly indenting the skin of my waist, marking me without even trying. The air in the throne room seemed to vibrate with the sheer power of our proximity. I saw him inhale deeply, pulling the scent of my fear and my awakening into his lungs, a smirk playing on his scarred, beautiful lips. The pack thought they had discarded a weakling. They didn't know they had delivered a weapon directly into the hands of their greatest enemy. As the heat of his body began to thaw the last of the ice in my veins, I knew one thing for certain. When we returned to the Silver Moon borders, there would be no more running. There would only be the reckoning. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, and for a moment, the world was nothing but the scent of smoke and the promise of a very violent tomorrow. The promise of a very violent tomorrow hung in the air like the heavy scent of ozone before a lightning strike, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. He didn't let me go, not even when the doors to the inner sanctum groaned shut with a finality that felt like a tomb ceiling or a sanctuary beginning. I could feel the rhythmic friction of his muscles through his skin, a steady, terrifying power that made the air around us shimmer with heat. He carried me through corridors that weren't built of wood or stone, but carved directly into the black heart of the mountain, where the walls were polished to a mirror shine and reflected the flickering torchlight in distorted orange streaks. Every step he took resonated in my own chest, a heavy metallic thrum that seemed to harmonize with the stuttering beat of my heart. I was a broken thing, a girl made of ice and silver burns, yet as he held me, I felt the first true stirrings of something ancient beneath my ribs. It wasn't a wolf, not yet, but a low, guttural vibration that answered the proximity of his power. He finally stopped in a chamber that smelled of crushed lavender, mountain air, and the sharp, metallic tang of a forge. A massive bed, draped in furs so thick they looked like a forest floor, dominated the room. He placed me down with a gentleness that was more frightening than his strength. It was the careful movement of a god handling a glass heart. My skin screamed as it touched the silk sheets, the transition from the freezing night to this climate-controlled opulence sending shocks of agony through my nerves. I gasped, my fingers curling into the bedding, and my breath hitched in a sob I had been holding back since the first howl of the hunt. "Be still, little spark," his voice rumbled, more a physical sensation in the room than a sound. He didn't leave. He knelt beside the bed, his presence looming like a thundercloud. He reached for a bowl of dark, viscous liquid that sat on a low obsidian table. The scent hit me, bitter herbs, honey, and something primal that made my nostrils flare. It was a poultice, but unlike any I had seen in the Silver Moon Pack. I watched, paralyzed by a mix of fear and a burgeoning, forbidden fascination, as he took a cloth and dipped it into the medicine. His eyes, those swirling vortices of violet and starlight, never left mine. He reached for my wrist, the one Silas had flayed with the silver blade. The wound was black and weeping, the silver poison still working its way toward my heart. When his fingers closed around my forearm, the heat was so intense I nearly cried out. It wasn't a burn. It was a soul-deep warmth that seemed to suck the poison toward the surface. "It will sting," he murmured, his thumb tracing the uninjured skin of my palm. "But the rot must be drawn out before the change can truly take root." As he pressed the cloth to the wound, I arched off the bed, a scream tearing from my throat. It felt like he was pulling a barbed wire through my veins. The silver fought back, its cold, sterile malice clashing with the raw, volcanic energy of his touch. My vision blurred, the room spinning into a kaleidoscope of shadows and fire. I could feel his other hand move to my shoulder, pinning me down, not with force, but with the sheer weight of his will. He didn't look away from my pain. He didn't offer empty comforts. He watched the agony as if he were memorizing the architecture of my soul. "Look at me, Ilara," he commanded. "Don't look at the wound. Look at the one who heals it." I forced my eyes open, clinging to the violet of his gaze, as if it were a lifeline. I saw things in his eyes, the collapse of empires, the birth of stars, and a loneliness so profound it made the cold of the blizzard look like a warm embrace. In that moment of shared suffering, the tension between us shifted. It was no longer just a king and a stray. It was two predators recognizing a shared frequency. The silver poison finally yielded, a dark, putrid steam rising from my skin as the herbs did their work. I slumped back into the furs, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The king stayed. He didn't call for a servant. He didn't delegate my care. He spent the next hour cleaning the blood and frost from my skin with a focus that was utterly consuming. Every time his hand brushed my thigh or my waist, the spark inside me leaped. It was a forbidden pull, a magnetic attraction that defied every law of the pack I had ever known. I was supposed to be a runt, a subservient omega, yet here was the most feared creature in the northern hemisphere, treating my body like a holy relic. "Why?" I whispered, my voice finally finding its way through the wreckage of my throat. "Why help me? I'm nothing. I have no wolf. I have no value." He paused, his hand resting on my ankle. He looked up, and the intensity of his expression made my heart stop. "They told you that you were nothing because they were terrified of what you are. A wolf is a beast of the pack, Alara, but what lives inside you, it doesn't need a pack. It needs a throne." He stood up then, his height dwarfing the room. "Rest now. Tomorrow my court will see you, and they will learn what it means to look upon a queen." I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, fueled by the exhaustion of the hunt and the strange, intoxicating warmth of the medicine. When I woke, the room was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, not from the sun, but from glowing crystals embedded in the ceiling. My body felt different. The leaden weight of my limbs was gone, replaced by a buzzing kinetic energy that made me want to run, to bite, to howl. I looked at my wrist. The wound was gone, replaced by a thin, shimmering scar that looked more like a tattoo of silver silk than a mark of trauma. A knock sounded at the door, not a polite tap, but a heavy, authoritative boom. 3 women entered. They weren't the soft, submissive omegas of the silver moon. They were warriors. Their bodies were lean and muscular, covered in leather armor and furs, their eyes sharp and intelligent. They didn't bow to me, but they didn't sneer either. They looked at me with a grim, professional respect that I found far more intimidating than Silas's cruelty. "The king has ordered your preparation," the tallest one said, her voice like grinding stones. "I am Kalith. We are your guard. You will eat, you will bathe, and then you will stand before the court of shadows." The immersion into the rogue king's world was a sensory assault. The bath was a natural hot spring carved into the rock, the water infused with minerals that turned the surface into a swirling pool of liquid gold. As I sank into the heat, Kalith and the others scrubbed the last of my old life away. They didn't speak much, but I could feel them sensing me. They were looking for the wolf Silas said didn't exist. Every time they caught a glimpse of the silver scar on my wrist, they exchanged looks of stunned realization. They dressed me in a gown of midnight blue velvet, trimmed with the fur of a white fox. It was heavy, regal, and clung to the curves I had spent years trying to hide under rags. They braided my hair with strands of obsidian and gold, weaving it into a crown that felt like a weight of responsibility. As they worked, I asked about the rogue king. I asked for his name. "He is Malachi," Kalith said, her eyes softening for a fleeting second. "The firstborn of the abyss, the one who refused to bow to the high alphas when they chose politics over blood. He is the king of the broken, and if he has chosen you, then you are the most dangerous woman in this mountain." The walk to the great hall was a gauntlet. The mountain was alive with the sound of his pack. Hundreds of wolves, many in their shifted forms, others in human guise. But they weren't like the silver moon. There was no chaotic bickering, no posturing for dominance. There was only a chilling, military discipline. As I passed, the wolves stopped. They didn't growl. They didn't snap. They lowered their heads in a silent, synchronized acknowledgement that sent shivers down my spine. The air was thick with the scent of pine, iron, and a dark, underlying musk that I realized was the collective power of the rogue king's lineage. Then, The doors to the great hall opened. It was a cathedral of shadow and flame. Thousands of candles floated in the air, held by some unseen force, casting a flickering amber light over the assembled court. At the far end, on the throne of Dragonbone, sat Malachi. He was dressed in black leather and gold, his massive shoulders draped in a cape of wolf skin that trailed down the steps. He looked like a god of war resting between battles. As I walked down the long aisle, the silence was absolute. I could feel the eyes of the court on me. Monsters, outcasts, and legendary warriors who had been hunted by the civilized packs for centuries. I felt small, yet every step I took felt heavier, more certain. The spark inside me was roaring now, a silent fire that made my skin tingle. I reached the foot of the throne and stopped. Malachi didn't move, but his gaze swept over me, from the crown of my head to the hem of my velvet gown. The forbidden tension between us snapped tight, a tether of raw, sexual, and spiritual energy that made the air between us hum. I saw his nostrils flare. I saw his hand clench the arm of his throne. "Step forward, Ilara," he said, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. I climbed the steps, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the top, he stood up. He was a head taller than me, a wall of pure, unyielding muscle. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. His skin was hot, his thumb grazing my lower lip. The court gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a wind through dead leaves. In the wolf world, such a gesture from a king was a claim. It was a declaration of ownership and protection. "Tell them," Malachi whispered, his face inches from mine. "Tell them who you are." "I am Ilara," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "I was a runt of the silver moon. I was left to die in the cold." "No," Malachi growled, his hand moving from my cheek to the back of my neck, pulling me closer until I could feel the heat of his chest through my gown. "Tell them what you felt when the silver touched your blood. Tell them what you felt when the rogue king claimed you." I looked out at the sea of shadows, at the monsters who were now my kin. The spark finally broke. It wasn't a wolf, not a standard one. It was something darker, larger, a shadow that lived in the marrow of my bones. I felt my pupils dilate, my vision shifting into the infrared spectrum of the predator. The room didn't look dark anymore. It looked alive with energy. "I felt the end of the old world," I said, the words vibrating with a power that wasn't mine alone. "I felt the beginning of the fire." Malachi smiled, a slow, lethal curve of his lips. He turned to his court, his arm dropping around my waist, pulling me flush against his side. The forbidden heat of him was overwhelming, a drug that I never wanted to stop taking. "The silver moon thinks they have purged their weakness," he announced, his voice a thunderclap. "But they have sent me my heart. They have sent the north its new queen. Prepare the war drums. We march when the moon is full." The hall erupted, not with cheers, but with a terrifying, rhythmic howling that shook the very foundation of the mountain. It was a sound of ancient hunger and impending slaughter. Amidst the chaos, Malachi leaned down, his lips grazing my ear. "You belong to the dark now, Ilara, and the dark has never looked so beautiful." He led me from the throne, not back to my room, but to the high balcony that overlooked the frozen wastes. The blizzard had stopped, leaving a world of pristine, deadly white under a sky of infinite stars. We stood there in the freezing air, but I wasn't cold. My blood was boiling. He stood behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We looked out over the territory that Silas and his pack called home, a territory that would soon be a graveyard. "They will come for you," Malachi whispered, his hands sliding up to rest just beneath my breasts, his touch a brand through the velvet. "Silas will realize his mistake. He will try to claim the runt he threw away. He will tell you that I am a monster, that I have bewitched you." "And are you?" I asked, tilting my head back to look at him. "Are you a monster?" He leaned down, his teeth catching the skin of my shoulder, a playful, predatory nip that made my knees weak. "I am the worst monster you can imagine, but I am your monster. And in this world, Alara, it is better to be the queen of monsters than the slave of men." The tension between us was no longer just a spark, it was a conflagration. I turned in his arms, my hands finding the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his dark, thick hair. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the king trying to maintain his composure against the primal urge of the alpha who had finally found his mate. His scent was everywhere now, an intoxicating blend of musk, winter, and power. He didn't wait for a signal. He crushed his lips to mine, a kiss that was a collision of worlds. It tasted of fire and ancient secrets. It was a claim, a promise, and a threat all rolled into one. As he kissed me, I felt the final barrier inside me break. My inner wolf didn't just wake up, she screamed. She was a massive, shadow-wrought creature with eyes the same violet as his. She was the mirror to his darkness. He pulled back, his breath heavy, his eyes glowing with an intensity that threatened to consume me. "You feel her now, don't you?" "Yes," I breathed, my heart racing. She's not like the others." "She is a shadow wolf," Malachi said, his voice thick with pride, a lineage thought extinct. "You were never an Omega, Ilara. You were a sleeper, and now that you are awake, there is no pack on this earth that can stand against us." We stayed on the balcony for a long time, watching the moon climb to its zenith. The immersion was complete. I was no longer a girl of the silver moon. I was a creature of the mountain, a part of the rogue king's court, and the mate of the most dangerous man alive. The forbidden tension that had defined our first hours was now the foundation of a new, terrifying reality. As we walked back into the warmth of the castle, I saw Calith waiting in the shadows. She looked at me, then at the king, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She knew what I was beginning to realize, that the hunt hadn't ended in the woods. It had only moved indoors. And in this game of kings and queens, the stakes were nothing less than the soul of the world. Malachi stopped at the door to his private study, his hand lingering on the handle. He looked at me one last time before the night, claimed us. "Sleep well, my queen. Tomorrow we begin your training. Tomorrow I teach you how to hunt the ones who hunted you." I watched him enter the room, the door closing with a soft, decisive click. I stood in the hallway, the silence of the mountain vibrating around me. I could feel my wolf prowling in the back of my mind, her tail lashing, her hunger growing. I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I was the dark, and as I walked back to my chambers, my footsteps silent on the obsidian floors, I knew that the Silver Moon Pack was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The bitter cold had tried to break me, but it had only tempered me into a blade. And Malachi was the hand that would wield me. The immersion into his pack, his life and his bed was not just a rescue, it was a rebirth. And as I lay down in the furs, the scent of him still clinging to my skin, I realized that the rogue king wasn't just my savior. He was my destiny. The hunt is over, but the war is just beginning. If you're rooting for the Shadow Queen, hit that like button and let the algorithm know the rogue pack is rising. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss the moment Silas realizes he made the biggest mistake of his life. The training began not with a blade or a bow, but with a cage of suffocating heat and the sound of my own heartbeat echoing against the obsidian walls of the subterranean pits. The air down here, miles beneath the mountain's crust, was thick and ancient, smelling of sulfur, wet earth, and the raw electric musk of Malachi's power. He stood in the center of the circular arena, his shirt discarded, his skin gleaming with a fine sheen of sweat that caught the flickering amber light of the torch baskets. Every scar on his back, jagged lines that told stories of wars fought before I was even a breath in the world, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He didn't look at me like a lover then. He looked at me like a sculptor staring at a slab of unrefined marble, searching for the crack that would either reveal the masterpiece or shatter the stone. Again, he growled, the word vibrating through the soles of my bare feet. I gasped, pushing myself up from the cold floor, my muscles screaming in a chorus of agony. For hours, he had been forcing me to reach for the shadow inside me, to coax the beast out of its slumber without the traditional catalyst of the moon. My fingernails were cracked and bloody from clawing at the stone, and my breath came in ragged, burning hitches that felt like swallowing hot coals. The shadow wolf within me was a restless, mercurial thing. She didn't want to be summoned. She wanted to burst forth like a tidal wave of ink, and every time I touched the edge of her consciousness, the sheer pressure of it threatened to liquefy my bones. I can't. Malachi, I can't find the thread, I whispered, my voice a dry husk. In a blur of movement too fast for human eyes to track, he was in front of me. He didn't offer a hand to help me up. Instead, he grabbed the front of my training tunic, hauling me to my feet until my toes barely grazed the floor. His eyes were no longer violet. They were black pits of infinite gravity, drawing me in, stripping away every defense I had left. The heat radiating off him was a physical weight, a furnace that made the air shimmer. "They are coming, Alara," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of the mountain's cold and the blood of the hunt. "Silas and his mongrels are a nuisance, but they are the least of our worries. There are forces in this world that have spent centuries perfecting the art of extinguishing shadows. If you cannot master the void inside you, it will consume you before the first silver arrow even leaves the string. Find the anger. Find the betrayal. Feel the ice of the forest floor and the laughter of the men who left you to die. Turn that cold into fire." He dropped me, and as I hit the ground, the spark he had mentioned before finally ignited. It wasn't a spark of light. It was a spark of absolute darkness. I felt my ribs expand with a wet, sickening crunch, the sound echoing in the silence of the pit like a dry branch snapping in a winter gale. It wasn't. The shift I had seen in others, the clumsy rearrangement of flesh and fur. This was a transubstantiation. My skin felt like it was being unzipped from the inside out, a cold, viscous liquid pouring through my veins where blood should be. I looked down at my hands and screamed, though the sound that left my throat was a low, subsonic boom that rattled the torch baskets. My fingers were dissolving into black smoke, a swirling mist of shadow that felt heavier than lead and sharper than diamond. The pain was exquisite. It was a visceral unmaking. I could feel my spine lengthening, the vertebrae clicking into place with the precision of a clockwork machine, while my skull reshaped itself, my jaw unhinging to accommodate teeth that were made of solidified night. I wasn't becoming a wolf. I was becoming a hole in the universe. Malachi stepped back, a look of primal triumph crossing his features. "Yes," he breathed, the sound barely audible, over the roar of the shadow in my ears. "Show them the nightmare they created." But as I stood there, a towering specter of smoke and obsidian claws, the world suddenly shifted. The shadow wolf didn't just give me strength. She gave me sight. I could see through the mountain, through the layers of rock and ice, sensing the life forces of everyone in the castle. I felt Kayleith's steady, burning resolve in the guard room. I felt the younger pup's flickering nervous energy in the lower tiers. And then I felt the rot. It was a cold, greasy sensation, like a slug crawling over my soul. It was coming from the high tactical chamber, where the king's inner circle gathered to map the defenses. I tried to speak, to warn Malachi, but my voice was a symphony of growls and whispers that I couldn't yet control. I lunged forward, my shadow form flickering like a dying candle, and slammed into his chest. I didn't hurt him, but the contact allowed the shadow to bridge the gap between us. For a split second, we shared a mind. Betrayal. The word echoed in the link, dark and bitter. Malachi's expression darkened instantly. He grabbed my shadowy mane, his touch the only thing that felt solid in my world of mist. "Who, Ilara? Show me." I focused on the greasy scent, the signature of the soul that was currently cutting a deal in the dark. A face flickered in our shared consciousness. Harlan, the general, the man who had stood at Malachi's right hand for 50 years. I saw him in a hidden alcove of the library, his face illuminated by a single guttering candle. He wasn't alone. Standing before him was a figure draped in heavy, ceremonial robes of white and silver, an emissary of the Inquisition. The Inquisition of Silver. They were the stuff of legends used to frighten wolf pups into obedience, an ancient order of humans who believed the world had been corrupted by the beast scourge. They didn't hunt for territory or food. They hunted for the total eradication of our kind. And Harlan, the man Malachi trusted with the mountain's keys, was handing them the map to our secret veins. "He thinks I am a heretic," Malachi whispered, his voice dangerously low, his grip on me tightening until I felt the shadow smoke condense under his fingers. "He thinks by bringing the Inquisition here, he can purify the throne and remove the taint of your shadow. The fool. He's opening the door to a plague." The shift began to recede, the shadow pouring back into my skin like spilled ink being sucked back into a pen. I collapsed, gasping, my human skin feeling raw and sensitive to the air. Malachi didn't wait. He scooped me up, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury. "Kayleith," he roared, his voice booming through the corridors of the training pit. The warrior woman appeared within seconds, her twin blades already drawn, her eyes darting to my exhausted form. "The general has turned," Malachi stated, the words falling like guillotines. "He has breached the North Gate's seals. The Inquisition is already in the tunnels. Signal the Shadow Watch. No mercy, no prisoners. I want Harlan brought to the throne room alive. I want him to watch as I burn his purifiers to ash." Kayleith didn't ask questions. She slammed her fist against her chest in a salute and vanished into the darkness. Malachi carried me up the winding stairs, his pace relentless. I could hear it now, even with my human ears. The sound of the mountain being violated. It wasn't the howl of wolves. It was the rhythmic, mechanical clank, clank, clank of armored boots and the hiss of pressurized canisters. "What is that smell?" I choked out, the air beginning to turn acrid and metallic. "Silver gas," Malachi growled, his jaw set so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. "They use it to paralyze the shift. It burns the lungs and turns the blood to lead. They are coming to harvest us, Ilara. They don't want a war. They want a slaughterhouse. We reached the great hall, but the atmosphere of regal power I had felt hours ago was gone, replaced by a chaotic, visceral horror. The floating candles were flickering and dying as the silver gas rolled in like a toxic fog. Wolves were collapsing in the hallways, their shifts halting halfway, leaving them in agonizing, distorted shapes, half man, half beast, trapped in a screaming limbo of bone and fur. Suddenly, the massive stained glass window at the end of the hall shattered inward. A volley of harpoons, trailed by heavy steel chains, hissed through the air. One struck a guard near the throne, the silver-tipped barb burying itself in his chest with a wet thud. He didn't just die, he ignited. The silver was treated with some kind of alchemical accelerant, and the man was reduced to a screaming pillar of white fire in seconds. Figures in white and chrome armor swung through the broken window, their movements clinical and precise. They carried long-barreled rifles that hissed as they discharged clouds of liquid silver. This was the outside force Malachi feared. The Inquisition didn't fight with honor. They fought with science and hatred. Malachi set me down behind the dragon-bone throne. Stay here. Do not let the gas touch your skin. If your wolf is a shadow, she might be the only thing immune to their poison, but your flesh is still vulnerable. He turned toward the invaders, his body expanding, his human skin ripping away as he fully embraced the beast. He was a mountain of fur and muscle, a god of the abyss, his roar shaking the very foundations of the peak. He dived into the fray, a whirlwind of claws and teeth, tearing through the armored suits of the Inquisitors as if they were made of parchment. But for everyone he killed, 3 more appeared. They were like a hive of white ants, relentless and devoid of fear. I watched from the shadows of the throne, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could see Harlan now. He had emerged from the side door, standing on the mezzanine, watching the carnage, with a look of fanatical sorrow. "It is for the best, Malachi," Harlan shouted over the screams and the hissing gas. "You have wedded yourself to the void. You have brought a demon into our sacred halls. I am saving the lineage from your madness." A silver-tipped harpoon whistled through the air, aimed directly at Malachi's shoulder, while he was occupied with 2 armored hunters. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I let the anger, the betrayal, and the cold of the silver moon pack flow through me. I didn't shift into the wolf. I reached out with my hand, and the shadow responded. A lash of pure darkness shot out from my fingertips, a whip of solidified night that intercepted the harpoon mid-air, snapping the steel chain like it was a spider web. Harlan's eyes found me behind the throne, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. "There she is, the witch, the shadow runt. Kill her, and the king will fall." 4 inquisitors turned their rifles toward the throne. I felt the air ionize, the smell of ozone and burning silver becoming unbearable. They fired simultaneously, 4 streams of liquid silver arching through the air like molten snakes. I dived forward, not away from the fire, but into it. As the silver touched me, I expected to burn. I expected the white fire to claim me as it had the guard. But the shadow inside me rose up to meet the threat. It didn't fight the silver, it swallowed it. The liquid metal hit the mist of my shadow form and simply vanished, neutralized by the infinite density of the void I carried. I landed on the floor in a crouch, my eyes glowing a feral, radioactive violet. The inquisitors paused, their mechanical visors tilting in confusion. They had spent 1,000 years learning how to kill wolves. They had no protocols for a shadow queen. I moved like a blur of smoke, passing through their ranks. I didn't need claws. I simply touched them, and where my shadow hand met their armor, the metal didn't break. It rotted. It turned to gray ash, exposing the terrified men beneath. I felt a cold, predatory joy as I watched their eyes widen. They were the hunters. They were the ones who brought the bitter cold. But I was the thing that lived in the heart of the blizzard. I reached the mezzanine in 3 heartbeats, flowing up the stone stairs like a rising tide. Harlan tried to draw his sword, a blade etched with ancient runes of protection, but I was faster. I wrapped my hand around his throat, the shadow smoke curling around his neck like a noose. His skin felt cold, his pulse thrumming with a frantic, desperate rhythm. You are a curse, he choked out, his eyes bulging. No, Harlan, I whispered, my voice echoing with the subsonic growl of the beast. I am the consequence. I didn't kill him. Malachi wanted him alive. I flung him over the railing, watching him crash onto the stone floor near the throne, where Caliph and the surviving guards quickly swarmed him. But the victory was short-lived. A deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the mountain, a sound so low and powerful it made my teeth ache. I looked back at the broken window. Rising from the snowy abyss outside was a massive airship, a behemoth of brass and iron, its hull covered in silver plating that shone like a second moon. On its prow was a giant mechanical lens, glowing with a concentrated, blinding white light. "The solar flare!" Malachi roared, his voice tinged with a rare note of genuine alarm. The light hit the center of the hall. It wasn't fire. It was pure concentrated lunar energy, distilled and magnified 1,000 times. It was the moon bite on a global scale. The light was so bright it turned the world to a flat, featureless white. I felt the shadow inside me shriek in agony. Darkness cannot exist where there is no shade, and this light was absolute. It began to peel the shadow away from my soul, layer by agonizing layer. I fell to my knees, my skin feeling like it was being sandblasted by starlight. Around me, the mountain was screaming. The wolves, who hadn't been killed by the gas, were being incinerated by the light, their very essences being bleached out of existence. Malachi was struggling to reach me, his massive form smoking as the light scorched his fur, his eyes fixed on the airship with a look of desperate, hopeless rage. "Elara, reach for the deep! Go deeper than the shadow!" he cried out, his voice nearly drowned out by the roar of the mechanical sun. I pressed my face into the cold obsidian floor, searching for a spark of darkness that couldn't be extinguished. I looked past the wolf, past the queen, past the girl who had been left to die. I looked into the very center of the mountain, into the primal, unthinking heart of the earth itself. There was a threat rising from the outside, a force of light and silver that sought to erase us. But they forgot one thing about the dark. It doesn't just hide in the corners. It is the foundation of everything. I felt a new power stir, not a shadow, but a weight. The weight of the mountain, the weight of the miles of rock above us and the fires of the core below. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the world. The floor beneath the Inquisitors began to liquefy, not from heat, but from sheer gravitational pressure. The airship outside wobbled, its mechanical lens cracking as the mountain itself began to tilt, the earth responding to the call of its new mistress. The solar flare flickered and died as the airship's engines groaned under the sudden, massive increase in gravity. The white light vanished, replaced by the bruised purple of the winter twilight. I stood up, my body no longer mist, but something solid, heavy, and terrifyingly permanent. I looked at Malachi, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Not fear of the Inquisition, but fear of what I was becoming. The betrayal had been dark, and the threat was rising. But as the first of the Inquisition's reinforcements began to crawl through the rubble, they realized their mistake. They hadn't come to purge a pack. They had come to wake a goddess of the deep, and she was hungry. The airship didn't just hover. It screamed, a mechanical banshee wailing against the gravity I had distorted, its brass plates groaning and bucking like a dying whale. The concentrated lunar light had failed, but the sky above the shattered ceiling was no longer empty. The true moon, the celestial mother of all monsters, had finally reached the absolute center of the heavens. It was a bloated, silver eye, weeping light onto the carnage below. And as its rays touched the obsidian floor of the great hall, the moon bind that Silas had tried to force with a silver blade began to happen of its own accord, deep within the marrow of my shattered soul. This wasn't a ceremony of the silver moon. This was a coronation of the void. I felt my heart stop, not in death, but in a pause that lasted an eternity, a rhythmic hiatus where the universe held its breath. Then it began. The first sensation was the sound of my own skeleton shattering, a staccato of wet cracks that echoed through the mountain like a million glass bells breaking at once. It was a rhythmic, violent percussion that forced me to my knees, my fingers digging into the stone, tearing through the obsidian as if it were wet clay. The shadow didn't just pour out of me, it exploded, a black, volcanic eruption that swallowed the remaining silver gas, turning the toxic fog into harmless ash. I watched my own arms lengthen, the skin stretching and splitting to reveal not fur, but a coat of solidified darkness that shimmered with the iridescence of a raven's wing. My joints reversed with a sickening thud, 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 a geometric realignment that turned my human grace into something predatory, ancient, and terrifyingly efficient. Malachi roared, his own transformation reaching its zenith beside me. He was a mountain of ash and fire, a beast of legendary proportions, but even as he tore through a line of inquisitors with a single sweep of his obsidian-tipped claws, he stopped. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of the nightmare I had become. I was no longer Alara the Omega. I was a shadow wolf of the First Era, a creature of smoke and teeth that stood 10 feet tall at the shoulder, my form flickering in and out of existence like a glitch in reality. My eyes were twin violets burning with the cold fire of a dead star, and when I opened my maw, the sound that emerged wasn't a howl. It was the sound of the earth's crust grinding together. The Inquisition didn't wait. They saw the goddess of the deep rise, and they responded with the only thing they understood: fire. A dozen harpoons hissed through the air, their silver-tipped barbs glowing with alchemical malice. I didn't dodge. I didn't need to. I moved my head with a rhythmic, liquid grace, and the air around me curdled. The harpoons didn't strike me. They slowed, then stopped, suspended in a pocket of distorted time before my shadow wolf snout. I exhaled, and the silver weapons didn't just fall. They dissolved into gray dust, their molecules stripped apart by the sheer density of the void I projected. Strike, tear, shadow, light. The rhythm of the battle took over. I lunged, a blur of darkness that was here one moment and 20 feet away the next. I didn't bite. I erased. Where my jaws closed around the armored torso of an inquisitor, there was no blood, only a silent implosion of shadow that left nothing behind but empty, crumpled chrome. Malachi was a whirlwind of visceral horror on my left, a rhythmic beast of muscle and bone, his every movement a testament to 1,000 years of war. We fought in a synchronized dance of destruction, a pair of binary stars revolving around a center of absolute fury. The sound of the hall was a cacophony of shattering armor, the hissing of steam, and the rhythmic thump-thump of our paws hitting the stone. The airship above began to descend, its mechanical lens glowing again, desperate to regain its hold on the situation. The commander of the Inquisition, a man in a gold-etched suit of power armor, stood on the prow, his voice amplified by a brass megaphone. "Burn the mountain, burn the heresy, let the light of the moon purify the abyss." I looked up, my violet eyes locking onto the mechanical sun. I felt Malachi's mind brush mine, a hot, searing connection that tasted of iron and eternity. Together, his voice rumbled in the depths of my consciousness. "Bring the sky to its knees, my queen." I didn't run. I flowed. I leaped from the mezzanine, my shadow form expanding until I was a cloud of ink against the silver sky. I caught the bottom of the airship's landing gear, the metal groaning as my weight, the weight of the mountain I had claimed, began to drag the behemoth down. Malachi followed, leaping from the throne with a force that cracked the dais, his claws digging into the brass hull of the ship. We were two parasites on a metallic god, tearing at its entrails as it tried to stay aloft. The solar flare fired again, but this time it was aimed directly at me, a pillar of concentrated lunar energy meant to bleach the shadow from my bones. I felt the heat, a rhythmic pulsing of light that tried to unmake my atoms. But the true moon was at her zenith, and she wasn't on their side. I reached out with my spirit, not to the mountain below, but to the silver orb above. I didn't fight the light. I became its lens. I channeled the solar flare through my own body, through the shadow core that Silas had called a defect. I felt the energy swirl within me, a rhythmic, spiraling force that turned the white fire into a violent purple beam. I redirected the energy into the heart of the airship's engines. The explosion was a symphony of brass and fire. The ship didn't just blow apart, it folded in on itself, the internal pressures of the gravity I was still manipulating, crushing the iron hull into a ball of scrap. We leaped clear as the wreckage plummeted into the snowy abyss outside the window, a falling star of human arrogance. I landed on the balcony, my shadow claws digging into the stone, my chest heaving with a rhythmic, powerful breath that felt like the tide of the ocean. Below us, in the great hall, the battle was ending. The remaining Inquisitors, seeing their flagship fall, were being hunted down by the survivors of the rogue pack. Kaleith was a blur of silver steel, her blades moving in a rhythmic, lethal arc that finished the work we had started. But the mountain was silent now. The only sound the distant, dying hiss of steam from the fallen airship. Malachi shifted back first, his human form emerging from the smoke, his skin covered in soot and the blood of his enemies. He looked up at me, still in my shadow wolf form, his eyes full of a reverence that bordered on worship. I felt the lunar climax begin to recede, the shadow ink pouring back into my pores, the wet crunch of my bones returning to their human geometry. It was a rhythmic, agonizing retreat, a reversal of the coronation that left me shivering and naked on the cold stone, my skin glowing with a faint, violet luminescence. He was there in a heartbeat, his shearling coat wrapped around my shoulders, his arms a furnace of heat that kept the winter at bay. "You did it," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "You broke the sun." I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was lined with ash, my vocal cords still vibrating with the subsonic power of the shift. I looked toward the throne, where Harlan lay in a heap of broken pride. He was alive, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for a god that had abandoned him. But he wasn't the only one there. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the broken mezzanine. He was tall, his black hair slicked back with sweat, his shearling coat torn and stained with blood. Silas. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood the remnants of the Silver Moon Pack, the warriors who had survived the run, their faces pale and gaunt in the moonlight. They hadn't come to help. They had come to scavenge. Silas looked at me, and for the first time in 23 years, I didn't see the Alpha. I saw a small, terrified man staring at a power he couldn't comprehend. "Ilara," Silas said, his voice a rhythmic tremor. We saw the light. We saw the ship fall. We came to bring you home. The pack has reconsidered. The defect was a mistake. You are one of us. You belong in the Silver Moon Circle." I felt Malachi's grip tighten on my waist, a low growl beginning to vibrate in his chest, but I stepped forward, the heavy coat trailing behind me, like a funeral shroud. I looked at Silas, at the man who had flayed my wrist and left me to freeze. I looked at the warriors who had laughed as I ran for my life. The rhythm of my heart was slow, steady, and utterly cold. "I am not a member of your circle, Silas," I said, my voice resonating with a depth that made him flinch. "I am the one who draws the line where your world ends." I raised my scarred wrist, the silver silk mark glowing with a rhythmic, violet pulse. "You didn't leave a runt in the woods. You left a debt, and now the rogue king has come to collect." Silas looked at Malachi, then back at me, his eyes darting to the carnage in the hall. The dead inquisitors, the crushed armor, the shadow rot that still ate away at the stone. He realized then that the run had never stopped. It had only changed direction. "Please," Silas whispered, the word a pathetic, rhythmic plea. "We didn't know. We were told you were human. We were told you were a burden. You were told what you wanted to hear so you could feel powerful while you stepped on the weak," I said, stepping closer until I could smell his fear, a sharp, acidic scent that was a pale imitation of the terror I had felt in the woods. "But the moon doesn't care about your stories, and neither do I." I turned to Malachi, the forbidden tension between us now a bond of blood and shadow that could never be broken. "What do we do with them, my king?" Malachi looked at the cowering Alpha of the Silver Moon, his gaze indifferent, as if he were looking at a beetle on the floor. "The Inquisition is a disease, but the Silver Moon is the rot that lets the disease in. They betrayed their own blood for the sake of a quiet life. In the mountain, we have a law for traitors." He looked at Calith, who stood waiting, her blades dripping red. "Strip them of their marks, take their coats, take their boots, and let them run. Let them see if the bitter cold is as merciful to them as it was to our queen." The rhythm of the hall changed. The rogue guards moved forward, a wall of silent, professional violence. Silas and his warriors didn't fight. They were broken, their spirits crushed by the sight of the shadow wolf. They were stripped of their dignity in a matter of minutes, left shivering in the center of the hall, their bare skin turning blue in the draft from the shattered windows. "Run, Silas," I said, the words a rhythmic echo of the ones he had whispered in my ear at the moonbind ceremony. "Run until your heart bursts, because if I catch you before the border, I won't be merciful." They fled into the night, a pathetic line of shadows disappearing into the blizzard that was beginning to howl again. I watched them go, but I felt no joy, only a deep, rhythmic sense of closure. The past was a frozen corpse, and the future was a fire that had only just begun to burn. Malachi led me back toward the throne, the surviving members of his pack falling into line behind us. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They moved with a rhythmic, somber grace, the grace of soldiers who had looked into the abyss and seen a friend. As we reached the dragonbone seat, Malachi stopped. He didn't sit. He turned to me and knelt, a movement so sudden and so profound that the entire hall went silent. "The mountain is yours, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum. "The shadow wolf has returned. The long night is over." I looked at him, at the king of ruins who had carried me to his throne, and I realized the secret he had whispered in the dark was true. I wasn't waiting for a shift. I was waiting for the moment I could finally stop pretending to be small. I sat on the throne, the dragon bone cold and hard against my skin, the weight of the mountain settling into my soul. Malachi stood at my side, his hand resting on my shoulder, a silent guardian of the darkness we shared. Outside, the world was a wasteland of ice and silver, but inside the mountain, the heat was rising. The lunar climax had passed, but the transformation was permanent. I was the Shadow Queen, the mistress of the abyss, and the spark that would burn the old world to the ground. As I looked out over the survivors of the night, I saw the beginning of a new pack. Not one built on hierarchy and fear, but on the visceral, rhythmic truth of the blood. A new threat was rising from the south, a second wave of the Inquisition, and the silver moon was still out there, dying in the cold. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the hunt. I was the hunt. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks, turning the snow to a bruised, violent pink, I felt the shadow wolf within me curl up and go to sleep, her belly full of the souls of my enemies. The battle was won, but the war was eternal, and as long as Malachi was at my side, I would welcome the darkness. "Bring me the maps," I said, my voice steady, rhythmic, and cold as the ice. "We have a world to reclaim." The maps were not made of parchment. They were etched in the very air of the war room, glowing with the same rhythmic violet pulse that now resided in my veins. We did not wait for the spring thaw. We did not wait for the Inquisition to regroup their mechanical legions. We moved like a silent black tide across the frostbite peaks, 1,000 wolves and a single shadow, carving a path through the permafrost that would never grow grass again. Malachi rode at the head of the vanguard, his massive human form draped in the hide of a white bear, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon, where the sky was stained a sickly, artificial orange. The citadel of silver sat there like a cyst on the face of the earth, a city built of gears, mirrors, and hatred. It was the heart of the machine that had labeled us as beasts to be harvested, and as we drew closer, the rhythm of my own blood began to sync with the vibration of the city's distant industrial engines. I felt the shift before we even reached the outer walls. It wasn't the agonizing bone snap of my first transformation. It was a fluid, welcoming descent into the dark. I ran beside Malachi's horse, my shadow wolf form flickering through the snow, a creature of smoke that left no footprints. I could feel the minds of the pack behind me, a web of consciousness bound together by my own will. I wasn't just their queen, I was their anchor. I felt Calith's cold hunger for vengeance, the younger wolves' frantic desire to prove their worth, and Malachi's steady, volcanic love that acted as the sun to my midnight. We were a single organism, a rhythmic pulse of predator and prey, and the City of Silver was our final feeding ground. The siege was not a battle of attrition, it was an execution. The Inquisition fired their silver cannons from the ramparts, the air filled with the rhythmic hiss-thump of pressurized canisters, but I didn't let the gas touch the pack. I reached out with my shadow, weaving a canopy of absolute darkness above our heads. The silver gas hit the mist and dissolved, neutralized by the void I carried in my chest. I felt the frustration of the men behind the walls, their mechanical certainty crumbling as their science failed against a force they had spent centuries trying to forget. I lunged at the main gate, my shadow form expanding until I was the size of a siege tower. I didn't use a ram, I used the weight of my soul. I slammed into the silver-plated steel, and the metal didn't just bend, it rotted. It turned to black ash under my touch, the shadow rot spreading through the hinges and the locks until the massive doors simply evaporated into the wind. We burst into the streets of the citadel like a flood of ink. The architecture was sterile, all glass and polished chrome, designed to reflect the moon and deny the shadow. But the moon was high and bloated, and she was no longer their source of power. She was mine. I moved through the streets, a blur of violet eyes and obsidian. Claws, my every movement, a rhythmic strike that left the Inquisition's armored guards in heaps of useless scrap. They tried to use their light blades, their concentrated lunar torches, but I swallowed the light before it could even leave the emitters. I was the dark that existed before the stars, and their little toys were nothing but flickers in a hurricane. I found the Grand Inquisitor in the high cathedral of logic, a building of white marble that looked like a bleached skull. He stood at the altar, surrounded by the last of his solar guard, his eyes wide with a fanatical, rhythmic terror. He held a staff of pure silver, topped with a lens that glowed with a blinding, artificial whiteness. He wasn't a man. He was a relic of an old world that feared what it couldn't cage. "You are a mistake," he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are the anomaly that will break the order of the universe. The beast cannot wear a crown." I shifted back to my human form as I walked up the aisle, my bare feet silent on the marble. I didn't need the coat or the crown. I was the weight of the mountain itself. Malachi stepped into the cathedral behind me, his presence a dark, roaring fire that made the stained glass rattle in its frames. He didn't intervene. He stood by the doors, his arms crossed, watching with a pride that made my skin hum. This wasn't his fight. This was the final payment of the debt Silas had started in the woods. "The order of your universe was built on the broken bones of my people," I said, my voice a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to come from the floor beneath his feet. "You called us monsters so you could feel like gods, but you forgot that gods are only as strong as the faith of those they oppress, and today the faith has ended." He leveled the staff at me, the lens pulsing with a final, desperate burst of light. The solar flare hit me full in the chest, a beam of pure, agonizing whiteness that should have turned my flesh to steam. I felt the heat, the rhythmic searing of my skin, but I didn't move. I didn't scream. I reached into the center of the light, my hand closing around the silver staff. The shadow inside me rose up, not as a wolf, but as a void. I drew the light into my own body, feeding it to the darkness until the lens cracked and the silver staff turned to black dust in his hands. The Grand Inquisitor fell to his knees, his face pale and withered, the light of his certainty finally extinguished. I didn't kill him with a blade. I leaned down, my lips grazing his ear, and whispered the secret that Malachi had told me on the throne. "The reason you hate the dark isn't because it's evil. It's because the dark is the only thing that knows the truth of what you are. You're just a man who is afraid of the cold." I turned away from him, leaving him to the mercy of Caliph and the pack. As I walked back down the aisle toward Malachi, the cathedral began to groan. The mountain was calling to me, the earth itself responding to the end of the machine. The glass windows shattered, not inward this time, but outward. The white marble walls cracking and crumbling as the shadow wrought I had introduced at the gates finally reached the heart of the city. The citadel of silver was falling, its rhythmic engines stuttering and dying, the orange glow of the sky fading into the deep, natural purple of a winter night. Malachi met me halfway, his hands catching mine, his touch the only thing that felt real in a world of falling stone. "It is done, Ilara," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "The debt is paid. The North is free." We walked out of the ruins of the cathedral as the city around us dissolved into ash and silence. The pack was waiting in the square, hundreds of wolves standing amongst the rubble, their eyes glowing with a rhythmic, steady light. They didn't howl in victory. They didn't growl in anger. They simply stood, a testament to a survival that should have been impossible. Silas was there too, huddled in the corner of a fallen archway, his skin blue and his eyes vacant, the bitter cold having finally taken the last of his sanity. I didn't even look at him as we passed. He was a ghost from a life I no longer recognized. We began the long march back to the mountain, the rhythm of our footsteps a steady, comforting drumbeat against the frozen earth. The world was different now. The air felt cleaner, the scent of wood smoke and pine needles returning to a land that had been choked by silver and grease. As we reached the edge of the deadwoods, the first light of a new dawn began to touch the horizon. It wasn't the artificial orange of the Inquisition or the bruised purple of the battle. It was a soft, pale gold, the color of a promise kept. Malachi stopped at the boundary, the line where the symbols had once been carved into the trees. He turned to me, the sunlight catching the scars on his face and the gold chains around his neck. He looked like the king he was, but more than that, he looked like the man who had found me in the snow. "You are quiet, my queen," he said, his hand sliding into mine. "I'm just listening," I replied, looking up at the peaks of the mountain that was now our home. For the first time in my life, there are no whispers of betrayal. There are no sounds of the hunt. There is only the wind. We climbed the final path to the iron-bound doors, the mountain opening for us as if we were its own breath. Inside, the hall was warm, the scent of lavender and bourbon welcoming us back to the center of our world. I walked to the throne, but I didn't sit. I turned and looked out over the balcony, at the vast white expanse of the north. The pack was settling in below, the pups yapping in the snow, the elders sharing stories of the night the shadow wolf broke the sun. I felt a sudden, rhythmic pulse in my wrist. The silver silk scar. It didn't burn anymore. It was a part of me, a reminder of the path from the kitchen floor to the dragon bone seat. I looked at Malachi, who was standing beside me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was the rogue who had carried me to his throne, but I was the queen who had decided to stay. The internal shift was finally complete. I wasn't an Omega, and I wasn't just a shadow wolf. I was the bridge between the beast and the throne, the silent power that kept the world from falling into the light or the dark. I leaned my head against Malachi's shoulder, the heat of his body a constant, rhythmic reassurance. We had burned the old world to the ground, and in its place, we had built something visceral, honest, and ours. The memory of the girl in the woods, felt like a dream someone else had had. I could still remember the fear, the smell of the pine needles, and the way the ice had raked across my cheek, but the pain was a distant echo, a ghost in the machine. I was no longer the prey. I was the one who defined the borders of the night. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the frostbite peaks, I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the mountain. It was a smell of ancient stone, of wild fir, and of a love that had been forged in the center of a blizzard. I felt the shadow wolf within me give a final, satisfied stretch before settling into a deep, eternal sleep at the base of my soul. She was no longer a weapon to be feared. She was the foundation of my power. Malachi pulled me closer, his lips brushing my temple. "What are you thinking about, Ilara?" I looked out at the world we had reclaimed, at the beauty of the bitter cold and the warmth of the fire we had built together. I thought about the first moment I had seen him in the storm, a shadow that had looked like death but had tasted like life. I thought about the cycle of the hunt and how it had finally, irrevocably, been broken. The last thing I smelled wasn't the pine needles or the damp earth. It was the metallic tang of my own blood, and the 7-foot shadow standing over me wasn't planning on calling for help because he knew I was the help the world had finally called for. The fire is out, but the warmth remains. If you enjoyed this epic story, leave a like to support the hundreds of hours that went into this production. Share the tale of Ilara and Malachi with someone who needs a reminder that the runt is often the most dangerous person in the room. Subscribe to stay in the shadows with us. We don't just tell stories, we create legends. Thank you for being part of the pack.